conversation any time in the past 3 years, we would have said it's looking grim and it's probably going to get grimmer. What's your view for Europe in 2014? Are we going to have some good news there too?
Well, actually, 2 years ago it would have been even worse, because I attended so many meetings in New York and Asia at the time, and everybody betted on a collapse of the euro within 2 or 3 months. And in one of the conferences in Washington, I said, probably we are going to muddle through and don't trust the collapse gurus. And people then said, is he naive or does he have some insight? Neither nor. And I felt a bit naive too, to be very frank. So in that sense, things have improved, no doubt about that. Unit labor costs have improved in most countries. Current account deficits have actually moved into positive territory in many countries, even in Greece, being very close now, 2% of GDP. The growth will be positive next year. Weak growth, but at least a bit more than 1%. Inflation is under control. Banks are becoming more stable. So that seems to be all good. But, and you said before, you might be overly optimistic. No, I'm not. There are still a lot of issues. One is we should not misinterpret the cyclical growth which we are seeing now and think that we can stop structural reforms. That's one of the big issues. Secondly, unemployment continues to be a big issue, over 12%. Thirdly, there is a waning political and public support of the euro concept. And I think we will have a parliamentary election next year, and we will have the most Eurosceptical European Parliament in history. So that shows that people are not fully convinced, and I think we do not have a real European vision for the future. So all in all, we are very much depending on the ECB's support. Without that, I think we would still be in the very difficult time which we had 2 or 3 years ago. But thanks to the liquidity injection, thanks to the words of Mario Draghi, and I just heard he's not a super Mario, I'm not saying he's a super Mario, but at least he gave tremendous reassurance when he said we are going to do whatever is needed to save the euro. And I think that people somehow believed, and so far we have a relatively stable environment, but still a lot of clouds on the horizon.
You started off saying things were looking better. You said it and you had a smile on your face and quite an upbeat tone. And then I've just been writing down what you were saying. Unemployment 12%, waning support for the euro concept, sluggish growth, no European vision. That doesn't sound very great. What needs to be done next year? What do you think are the crucial things that have to happen for this whole thing to stay together and for things to improve?
Well, in 2 years ago, people always said 5 things should be done. The first one is to make debt sustainability in Greece stronger. Now, thanks to the private sector involvement, some has been achieved, but not all. And there's still a debt to GDP ratio of over 160%. This is simply not sustainable. Now, whether the public, it has actually moved from private hands into public hands, whether they just extend maturities or lower interest rates to practically zero, that is one thing. But it doesn't allow them to go back and have access to the capital market before we have a healthier debt to GDP ratio. That's why I think we have to one day say, okay, we forgive as the private sector involvement, also the public sector has to do the same, just statistically to improve the picture. Secondly, we have to do everything with structural reforms in the other countries, and some have done extremely well. Ireland, Portugal is on the right track, Spain to some extent. Italy is a wealthy country, but should do much more. And so in that sense, probably a lot has been tackled, but not sufficient. The third one is to have a umbrella or a firewall in place, which we have. It's smaller than what people asked for at the time. It was normally, the number was 2 trillion euros. It's about 500 billion. But still, we have the European Stability Mechanism in place, which is good. Fourth, of course, we have to strengthen the banking system. We are halfway through that, but not yet. And as you know, we will have further tests next year. And the second one is to inject the liquidity, which was done by the ECB. But now comes the big question mark. What is the next political step? And there, of course, a lot has been done in relative terms, if you think the first 20 years and the last 5 years, but not sufficient to really make it a strong, united Europe. And actually, in some areas, we have become rather fragmented than united, and I think that's a big issue. So a lot has to be done, but primarily on the political side.
I want to turn to the politics in a minute, but just on the, you mentioned the banking, you said the Europeans are doing and now this big asset quality review. Here in the US, the stress tests were really a kind of part of the turnaround in terms of the economy recovering. And Europe did several attempts at stress tests and failed. And now this asset quality review by the European Central Bank is widely seen as the absolute sort of central requirement for turning around the banking system, for turning around confidence in lending and so forth. Do you think the ECB will do a job that is good enough that people really believe, okay, we've got to the bottom of the problem?
Well, they have to, because otherwise we are not getting the confidence in the will. The first thing is that we now have, or will have, a single supervisor, which is very good, because so far people didn't trust individual supervisors in different countries. Secondly, we will have a single rule book, which is very important, because definitions of risk rating and other things were different from country to country. That's not good. Thirdly, what we will not have is a good, proper resolution mechanism in place, and we will not have a strong support how to recapitalize banks out of the European Stability Mechanism. Germany is not in favor of that. But the ECB will have now a testing of the 130 banks, and hopefully this will be a tough testing. And we have to, because otherwise the single supervisor will start on the wrong footing. And secondly, the question of having rather a united recapitalization of banks will never fly if people, especially the German government, will not start believing that now we have a healthier banking system, because we don't want to fund the legacy assets in certain banks. But the big question, of course, remains, why is Europe lagging the United States? And I think there are two issues. The first one is the TARP program, which was a very bold one. People were forced to accept fresh capital, and they could repay that. And why was that easier? Because in the United States, people accepted that and were very pragmatic. I think in Europe, this would have started an ideological debate about a certain banking business model, about compensation and all of that. That's why we were extremely reluctant to accept a mandatory TARP program. The second one, which is actually more interesting, Europe has not changed the banking landscape. We bailed out the failed banks, but they stay intact. I mean, one day they will all be back in the market. Whereas in the US, you have absorbed the failed banks into stronger banks. Now, with that, created a huge concentration issue, in my view. But look at the strengths and the profitability of the large US banks. They make in a quarter about that what the largest European banks now make in a year, if it at best. And I think that shows that the way to the restructuring of the banking system has been different. Now, the third point is, of course, we had a debt crisis, which made it even more difficult. And the sovereign bank nexus is a big problem in Europe, and it has not been solved. On the contrary, actually, sovereign risks in the bank balance sheet have rather increased in certain countries.
Does that mean that Europe still has a lot of secular shake-up in the banking industry ahead of it? What's the banking industry going to look like in the coming years?
Well, look at the valuation levels. I mean, valuation levels, price to book is below 1. I mean, substantially below 1, whereas in the US it's above 1. So obviously markets just don't believe and trust the banking system yet. I think we need a shakeout. We need, first of all, those banks which are not strong enough have to be absorbed by others. Secondly, we need more consolidation going forward. Now, it's not easy to do that given the acquisition currency banks are having, but this has to come. And of course, we need a more or a less fragmented money and capital market again. And especially on the retail side, if each country has its own different legal requirements, it's very difficult to have the economies of scale which you need and which you would have in other parts of the world. So these are things which has to happen. And of course, the asset quality is still a open question. That's why valuations are so low, because if you look at the capital ratios, there's not a big difference between the US banks now and the European banks. I'm talking about the better banks. But what is in the balance sheet? How much legacy assets are still there? And of course, how many of the legal risks are still coming to the surface?
I'm going to open to questions in just a second, but one last question on that. You mentioned the importance of dealing with the legacy assets. Earlier, you mentioned Germany's role. Germany, as you say, is the key problem to dealing with that. Germany has a new government now, a new coalition government, coalition contract signed. Is this country, which is the biggest economy in Europe and the leader in some sense of Europe, going to play a more constructive role next year?
Well, not in the sense of offering even more funds to other countries. That will not be the case, because the public support is just not there for doing this. But in all fairness, Germany has offered tremendous guarantees. I mean, this is a number which is staggering, if you not only on absolute terms but also in relative terms. So in that sense, I would not play down the role Germany has already played in many ways, and Germany has clearly been leading the rescue operations in Europe. But and on the other side, what is also positive, that the Grand Coalition, especially actually the Socialist Party, is probably even more pro-European than the Conservative Party. I mean, the Steinbrück as a candidate to become chancellor talked about Eurobonds, talked about guaranteeing Greek debt, about banking union and many other things. So in that sense, I think it will be a strong, supportive European government. But it's also fair to say that more on the conservative side, people are very critical. And if you go to certain events where you have family-run businesses or affluent people, you are surprised how many are saying this is not good for Germany and may have to exit the euro one day, which would be a disaster because Germany is the major beneficiary of the euro concept. But it just shows that the political majority is not so easy to gain. And on top of that, what people maybe are less familiar with, there is the Constitutional Court. We need in Europe a debate on the future constitution, because so far each Constitutional Court has to assess certain measures based on national constitutions, which is right. But if you delegate more authority, if you are willing to support other countries even stronger, you are to some extent violating your constitutional requirements. And that is something which is not decided yet in Germany, but the Constitutional Court is still debating how far Germany can go.
Thank you. Are there any questions? Nobody has any questions about the future of Europe? Surely there are. Gentlemen here. Oh, was there someone back there? Then if I don't mind, because you have already asked a question. Thank you. I'm sorry, it shows how blind I am. It may well be that people are raising their eyes. I can't see. Yes, gentlemen.
Yes, I have a question. Just following on from that last query about Germany playing a more constructive role in the year ahead, what's your reaction to the critique offered by the IMF and the US Treasury of Germany's persistent trade surplus as a negative factor for the adjustment process in the Eurozone and more generally for the global economy? I mean, the suggestion is that there are specific policies that the government could implement that would help with this rebalancing process.
Well, let me say first, I mean, Germany has been criticized as being the sick man of Europe for many years. Now, finally, after the Schröder reforms, they have become, among others, much more competitive and actually have become a very strong export country. But most of the export successes are actually to emerging markets and to the United States. So it's less an issue of the European concept. And as I said before, many of the European countries have now moved from a current account deficit into a current account surplus, which shows that things are changing. But it is clear that Germany needs more infrastructure investments, a number which is actually amazing. 1/3 of the bridges are over 40 years old. So a lot can be done in terms of infrastructure investments. I think consumption has to be stronger, and no doubt that the cost level will increase right now, and which support the consumption level in Germany. So that's all positive. But to ask Germany to become less competitive in order to help the others, in my view, is a wrong recipe. And it's a recipe for failure. Germany is the strongest economy and should play that role. And by being this, they were also capable of supporting other countries much stronger. Look at the, if you look at the target balances of the central banking system, if you look at the guarantees Germany has given to others, I mean, these are terribly high numbers, and that you can only do when you are successful. So I don't think others should ask for a weaker Germany, but we should ask for some more consumption and more investment, so in order to reduce the current account surplus. But on top of that, others have to do the homework. And one of the countries which certainly is lagging is France. France has to, unfortunately, to initiate more and tougher reforms, as Germany did. Now, you asked before about the new government. Unfortunately, the outcome of the election has been somewhat difficult. The Liberal Party lost, was a disaster. The Social Democrats and the Green Party were disappointed, but the Merkel government, or the Merkel CDU party, just didn't get enough seats to have majority. Now, if you need only a few seats and you need a strong coalition partner to move in, he will only do that if he doesn't want to be a complete junior partner and nothing to say when he asks for some dramatic measures. And of course, that's what has happened. So we will actually reverse some of the successful Schröder reform agenda in pension and labor market with much more interventionist measures like minimum wage and things like that. So I don't think that will be very good for Germany, by the way. And hopefully it's not happening, but it may be in a year or two from now, we are saying that Germany is actually losing competitiveness because of that. I think they have to remind everyone and remember that what has happened in the Agenda 2010 has actually been a starting point for the competitive German economy.
It is an irony that the country that is doing in some ways so well in Europe is the country which is reversing a lot of the things that have got it there.
Well, that's always the same, you know. First you want to have a big cake, and then if you have a big cake, you want to share it with a lot of people, and by doing this, you are reducing the cake. I mean, that's probably what is going to happen.
I'm afraid we are running out of time, but I want to ask you just briefly two things at the end. One, very specifically, will every member that is in the euro area now be in the euro area at the end of next year?
Absolutely. I mean, Greece will be the only one, but what we always underestimated is the contagion impact which still would happen. And Greece, I mean, would be a disaster. And I think it's, I always said the same, further construction is much cheaper than a destruction.
And the final one is, you mentioned political support for the euro falling. Which country are you most worried about losing support for the euro?
Well, I mean, those where unemployment rates are very high, of course, they are suffering and saying that's not good for us, we were better off. I mean, you cannot have any competitive devaluations anymore. You are locked into a monetary system, and that makes it tough. That's why we have deflationary pressures in certain countries. You can only become more competitive by reducing wages, by increasing productivity, by reducing price levels, and that makes life very difficult. Thirdly, there's a little bit of sentiment which is very bad. Instead of having social cohesion, people are talking more about resentments. I mean, the Germans saying, you know, some of countries in the southern periphery are not working hard enough. The others are saying they are asking too much in terms of austerity, are killing our societies. So that is not very good. We have to come back to a united spirit. And I always say in sports, I mean, The US is playing against China, or China against Japan, but Europe is not playing against anyone. We are playing country by country, with one exception. Actually, it's the Ryder Cup in golf. But it's amazing. You know, we need some European vision and a strong feeling that only united we can play at eye level with other countries such as the United States or China, and that is missing. And we do not have yet the European political leaders who are really expressing this kind of European vision in a strong way, too much focusing on the national issues.
Well, that will be a big thing to watch, I think, whether we do start getting that in Europe. Thank you very much indeed.